The Great Pyramid of Giza was already standing, fully built, for centuries before the last woolly mammoth on Earth took its final breath. That is not an exaggeration or a rounding error. It is a documented radiocarbon fact, and it directly contradicts the version of mammoth extinction most people carry around without ever questioning it. The idea that these animals disappeared alongside the rest of the Ice Age megafauna roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, wiped out in one broad climatic collapse alongside saber-toothed cats and giant ground sloths across the rest of the planet. They did not, at least not all of them, and not at the same time. A small, isolated population survived on a remote island off the coast of Siberia for another 6,000 years after every other mammoth on Earth had already disappeared, and for over a decade, the leading scientific explanation for how that specific population finally ended turned out to be built on only two genomes, and a conclusion that a far more thorough study has since taken apart. Wrangel Island sits in the Arctic Ocean, roughly 80 miles off the coast of northeastern Siberia, a remote strip of tundra now protected as a nature reserve and recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site partly because of its unusual paleontological record. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and global sea levels rose, the strip of land connecting it to the Siberian mainland disappeared underwater, cutting off whatever mammoths happened to be living there at the time from the rest of the species entirely, with no way back and no further contact with mainland populations from that point forward. Genetic reconstruction suggests the founding population numbered as few as 8 individuals, an extraordinarily narrow genetic bottleneck for any large mammal to pass through and still survive across multiple generations. From that narrow starting point, the population grew and stabilized at somewhere between 200 and 300 animals, holding remarkably steady for roughly 6,000 years in near total isolation, save from the human hunters and habitat loss that had already ended every mainland population across Siberia, Europe, and North America by that point. Then, approximately 4,000 years ago, radiocarbon dating of recovered tusks and bones shows the population disappeared, and the pattern of dated remains suggests the ending was fairly abrupt, rather than a slow, gradual fade toward extinction stretched across many additional centuries. If you find this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. The explanation that dominated the conversation for years arrived in March of 2017, when researchers Rebecca Rogers and Montgomery Slatkin, both working at the University of California, Berkeley at the time, with Slatkin a professor of integrative biology there, published a study in the journal PLOS Genetics, a peer-reviewed outlet specializing in genetics and genomics research. Their approach compared exactly two mammoth genomes, one from a mainland individual that lived roughly 45,000 years ago, when the species numbered in the tens of thousands across an entire continent, and one from a Wrangel Island individual that lived about 4,300 years ago, drawn from a population of only a few hundred animals total. Both genomes had originally been sequenced by a separate research group, and Rogers and Slatkin's contribution was applying detailed comparative analysis to data that already existed, rather than generating new sequences themselves. The difference between the two genomes was striking. The island mammoth carried a significant excess of harmful mutations, including deletions, broken genes, and premature stop codons scattered through its DNA. The genetic signature theoretical population geneticists had long predicted should appear in any species reduced to a small, isolated population for an extended period. Specific losses stood out clearly: genes controlling the sense of smell and genes involved in urinary proteins had lost function entirely, and a mutation in a gene called FOXQ1 likely gave these animals a strange, translucent, satin-like coat, a mutation that in other mammals, including laboratory mice, is linked to poorer insulation and digestive problems. Rogers and Slatkin described the overall pattern as a genomic meltdown, the genetic hallmark of a population so small for so long that harmful mutations were accumulating faster than natural selection could effectively remove them from the gene pool. The theory spread immediately and widely. It offered a tidy, almost poetic explanation. Not predators, not a single environmental disaster, but a slow genetic unraveling built into the basic mathematics of small, isolated populations, the kind of quietly inevitable ending that made for a compelling documentary narration. It appeared across major science outlets within days of publication and became the standard explanation repeated in documentaries, museum exhibits, and popular science writing for years afterward, treated as a satisfying, mechanistically sound answer to a genuine extinction mystery that had puzzled researchers for decades. Researchers went a step further to test whether the theory held up biologically rather than just statistically, since a mutation looking unusual on paper does not automatically mean it damaged the animal carrying it in any meaningful functional sense. Geneticist Vincent Lynch and his team took specific mutated genes identified in the Wrangel Island genome and rebuilt them in the laboratory, inserting the ancient variants into living cells to directly test whether they actually impaired protein function the way the genomic data implied, rather than simply assuming a mutation was harmful because it appeared unusual in a sequence alignment on a computer screen. The results largely supported the broader Meltdown narrative at the time. Several of the mutations did appear to genuinely damage the proteins they were supposed to produce, reinforcing the idea that this population really had been in serious genetic trouble in its final stretch on the island. The problem was that the entire foundational claim rested on comparing exactly two animals separated by tens of thousands of years, a sample size statistically incapable of showing what actually happened across the full 6,000 years the population spent isolated on the island, rather than just the two isolated snapshots the original researchers had access to. In 2024, geneticist Marianne de Hask of Uppsala University in Sweden led a team that finally built what the original study never had: a genetic timeline stretching across dozens of individuals spanning the population's entire time on Wrangel Island, from its earliest founders through its final generations, published in the journal Cell. The results overturned the Meltdown explanation directly. While the population did show some accumulation of mildly harmful mutations consistent with its small size, the decline was nowhere near severe enough to explain a total population collapse, and genetic diversity across most of that 6,000-year window remained considerably more stable than the original two-genome comparison had ever suggested it could be. De Hask summarized the finding bluntly. The data indicated something else, and something sudden caused the population to collapse, not a gradual genetic unraveling playing out generation after generation, the way the 2017 study had proposed. Subscribe to not miss the next one. That reversal leaves the actual cause of the Wrangel Island mammoths' extinction as a genuinely open question rather than a settled one. Geneticist Patricia Pechnerova of the University of Copenhagen, who has worked extensively on the broader genetic history of the species and holds a position as a National Geographic explorer, has described the final Wrangel extinction as only the last link in a much longer chain of events stretching back tens of thousands of years, rather than a single, cleanly explainable moment in isolation from everything that came before it. Candidate explanations currently being discussed among researchers include a specific catastrophic weather event, potentially a season of unusual icing or freezing rain capable of sealing off the limited tundra vegetation the population depended on for food during the harsh Arctic winters, the arrival of humans on the island around the same general time window, archaeological evidence suggests, and the possibility of a disease outbreak moving rapidly through an isolated, genetically narrow population with little immune diversity to draw on when facing a new pathogen. None of these explanations has been confirmed as the definitive cause, and researchers actively studying the population have been explicit in recent publications that the question remains unresolved, rather than papering over the gap with a confident guess, the way earlier popular coverage of the genomic meltdown theory tended to do for years. What makes this correction significant extends well beyond one island and one extinct species, touching on how popular science itself handles genuinely uncertain questions. The original 2017 study was not bad science, and it is worth being direct about that distinction rather than treating it as a cautionary tale of sloppy research. It used the best available genomic data at the time, applied established population genetics theory correctly to the samples available, and reached a conclusion that made logical sense given a sample size of exactly two individuals separated by tens of thousands of years. What it could not do, with only two genomes to compare, was distinguish between a population in genuine terminal genetic decline and a population that was simply small, genetically quieter than its mainland ancestors, and stable for thousands of years before something entirely unrelated to its genetics ended it abruptly and without much warning to whatever animals were still alive on the island at the time. That distinction only became visible once a much larger, more carefully sampled dataset existed to test the original claim against, 7 years after the first conclusion had already become the accepted popular explanation repeated in classrooms, nature documentaries, and museum placards around the world. What remains true, regardless of which specific cause eventually gets confirmed, is the timeline itself. And that timeline alone is enough to overturn what most people assume about this animal without needing any further correction at all. Woolly mammoths were alive, breeding, and surviving on a remote Arctic island, while ancient Egyptians were already constructing monuments that still stand today, visited by millions of tourists every year, thousands of years after the species was supposed to have vanished entirely from the planet, according to the version of events taught in most classrooms. Their population held on for 6,000 years after the rest of their species disappeared from Earth, an isolated colony surviving in near total silence at the edge of the Arctic Ocean, only to vanish suddenly for reasons that a landmark 2017 genetic study got only partially right, built on a foundation of just two genomes and a mathematically reasonable but ultimately incomplete picture of what that population actually experienced across 60 centuries of isolation. A far more thorough 2024 study has since shown the real story was more complicated and considerably more mysterious than a slow genomic collapse could ever fully explain, leaving one of the most famous extinction stories in paleontology with its actual ending still unwritten more than 4,000 years after the last mammoth on Wrangel Island took its final breath.